All right, we're recording. Connor, thanks for doing this. It's a pleasure to get. This is the first time we've actually spoken. We've texted and DM'd a little bit. Father Robinson introduced us like a year ago now, I think. But it's a pleasure to get to speak to you. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Other than the real-time documentation of the fall of my country, the eyes of the world seem to be on that, and it's all I ever get to talk about these days, rather than fun things that I used to do, like comic books and films and gardening. So I'll go back to doing all those things once we've fixed everything. Once we've pressed the fix everything switch, which I keep being told we aren't allowed to press that because it's racist or something.
Well, I would love to talk about that stuff with you sometime. We'll have to make some time to do that because that sounds like a great time. But so I wanted to bring you on because you have a show on Sundays on Timcast. Is it Timcast or Timcast RL that channel is on?
It's on the Timcast channel that's hosted the Culture War. So we do an hour on Saturday, which is just me and my co-host Tate Brown, and then an hour on Sunday, which is me, Tate, and a revolving guest from the Anglo-Sphere.
So I was watching you Sunday with Oren. It's also on Connor's channel. I should say everybody should go subscribe. It's just Connor Tomlinson. The collab feature on YouTube that's also on Connor's channel. So Sunday you had Oren on, and the discussion was very interesting. But the thing I was most interested in was at one point you just gave this very quick breakdown of the long-term effects of how badly Tony Blair beat the Conservative Party. And I realized that I have no idea how politics in the UK works, right? I know the actual system, right? I kind of have a general idea of you don't vote for people, you vote for parties, and the party is picking which people run in which areas. And then that's all I know. But the most interesting thing to me was the way you were talking about the way we and the reactionary right in America talk about the effects of things like the Floyd riots, the long-term effects of them, the long-term effects of DEI, the long-term effects of Mitt Romney's strategy dying off, and John McCain versus Trump and that kind of stuff. And I thought those are the kind of things that I think are really interesting about politics because they actually allow us to understand principles that are actually affecting the way that the people in charge are, the grudges they have and the ways they're thinking that allow us to more accurately understand what's happening to us in our countries. So I was hoping you would come on and talk about that, and you agreed to. So I think a great place to start is please correct all of the things I just said that are wrong about the UK's voting system and parliamentary system.
No, so I don't think you said anything wrong. And I think my understanding of American politics is only slightly more evolved than many of my American friends' understanding of my domestic politics because I've visited America more frequently, and it's basically the imperial capital of the global American empire, and we are but a vassal state at this point. There's a reason there's a McDonald's in every high street, right? So you have to understand how America is ticking over to understand how your own country's tied up in that. And fortunately, the American State Department, now that our guys are in charge, and I've met and had dinner with a few of them and passed notes in class, as it were, regarding what's going on in our country, they're a lot more concerned about the state of the UK than our own government is, because our own government is selling us down the river demographically, culturally, economically, and still demanding that we go and die in a ditch in Ukraine to defend gay race, communism, replacement migration. No thanks. So as far as the UK political system goes, so we have a parliamentary monarchy. So technically the government serves at the behest of the king, but it's customary under Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights of 1689 that the monarchy doesn't really intervene in political processes that much. There's a King's Speech once a year that gives royal assent to basically whatever the government wants to do. And it's very rare that the king or queen will refuse to give that assent because it would be seen as politicizing politics. It's one of these contemporary liberal delusions that everyone that's read their Schmidt knows is a delusion, but politicians themselves either haven't read their Schmidt and believe liberalism to be the apotheosis of philosophy, given that it was the child of the Enlightenment after all, and by the nature of calling itself Enlightenment means, hey, we're all enlightened now. Or they've read Schmidt and they have recognized the friend-enemy distinction and have put us squarely in the enemy category. The best example of this is our Attorney General, Lord Hermer, who is a Jewish communist activist. And he mentioned Schmidt in a recent speech and said that people that want to leave things like the European Convention on Human Rights or the UN's Refugee Convention are breaking apart international law, and they are abiding by Schmidt's critique of international institutions that there's no such thing as neutrality. And Schmidt was involved in the Nazi Party, even though he renounced membership and was later translated by Jewish academics, and he just has some sensible insights. And therefore, if you don't believe that there is such a thing as a neutral institution, you're literally Schmidt and you're literally Hitler. So this is the games they play. But anyway, so Britain's parliamentary democracy has it allowed Parliament to basically be sovereign over everything for quite a long time until Tony Blair came along. And Tony Blair reconfigured the architecture of Britain's constitutional settlement and meant that Parliament is no longer sovereign and that actually the civil service runs the entire country. So whenever something happens in British politics, it's usually not down to the ministers themselves. The ministers are the public-facing salesman of whatever the managerial state wants to do. Sort of the Hobbes' Leviathan, James Burnham's managerial revolution, all of this is true and concentrated in Britain. And two pieces of legislation, or I suppose three, did this most intensely. So the Human Rights Act of 1998, which Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, wrote the textbook for lawyers on how to apply. It wrote the European Convention on Human Rights into British law. The actual wording at the time was something akin to, we want to more subtly weave European law into British law. And European and continental law is very different, especially in the aftermath of the Second World War, to British common law. I mean, America has a broadly British common law system because it's founded on Blackstone's formulation, on Magna Carta, on the 1689 Bill of Rights, which is what your Constitution and your Declaration of Independence was based on. And the fact that we believe men and women are made in the image of God, Imago Dei. And so Ben Franklin paraphrased Blackstone's formulation when he said, it's better that 100 guilty men go free than one innocent person be persecuted, because it's based on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. God abhors the persecution of any innocent life. It's a sin against creation itself, basically. So we have that system, whereas the continental legal system that was created after the French Revolution and the international legal system that was created after the Second World War, there's a really good book on this, by the way. Where is it? It's by Matthew Rosenbaum, and it's called Prosecuting Nazi War Criminals. And it basically makes you know when like leftists and rightists look at the same picture and the leftists go, that's a good thing, and we go, oh my God, that's horrible. But it's the same. Yeah. He does that for saying, well, we need this international legal system to sit atop national sovereignty in case something like the Holocaust happens again, or the First World War, where certain countries were unwilling to prosecute their own war criminals, which then led to certain atrocities. And so the majority white populations of Europe should be so distrusted. There should be international institutions with these hypothetical legal codes that apply to everyone, everywhere, anytime and place, which of course are wielded maliciously because there's no such thing as a neutral institution. They should be weaponized against European majorities to protect minorities from the Holocaust from ever happening again. And so that sort of legal code system is enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights. That mistrust of majorities and this belief that there is such a thing as a universal legal system that applies to all people, all times, all places, all cultures, unmoored from Christian givens. And that was written into British law. And now we have a foreign court that has more jurisdiction than Parliament, and is the reason why we can't deport any foreign sex offender that keeps coming into this country. And people will know by now that Britain has an international reputation as being the dumping ground of the sex criminals of the Third World, because there is a new rape every hour in London, and over half of these are committed by migrants. That's either ones who have just arrived yesterday or have British citizenship, or even the sons and daughters of immigrants. So the majority of sex attacks in our capital city don't need to happen, but we can't remove those people because they appeal to the European Convention on Human Rights that says if they were returned to their country of origin, it would upset their children, even though they're pedophiles, or that they would be tortured by being thrown in prison in their home country. And according to a 1996 ruling, you're not allowed to take the criminality of an applicant into account because all of these rights are absolute. So 1998 Human Rights Act, first piece of constitutional vandalism. The second was the 2005 Constitutional Reform Act. It created a Supreme Court. Britain's never had a Supreme Court until then. So there's people who have t-shirts and underpants older than the British Supreme Court, but it created a court that sits above Parliament. So Parliament is no longer the supreme legislator. And this was best exemplified when, during the Brexit deliberations, when Theresa May couldn't get a Brexit deal over the line, she resigned. Boris Johnson was elected installed as Prime Minister by the Conservative Party. He was elected by a majority of MPs. Right before the election, he prorogued Parliament, basically shutting it down so that his Brexit deal could get over the line. And a group called the Good Law Project, one of these Orwellian named internationally backed NGOs, brought a case against Boris Johnson, and the Supreme Court declared the proroguing of Parliament to be unlawful. Now, that isn't the case, because if the King did not prevent, or the Queen at the time, Boris Johnson from proroguing Parliament and allowed it to proceed, then it is lawful. But the Supreme Court has basically overruled both the monarchy and Parliament, and so it's created a constitutional crisis that's never been resolved. So we need to scrap the Supreme Court to get any kind of sovereignty back over Parliament, and it's the reason why we're undergoing the sort of judicial deliberations that the likes of repealing birthright citizenship or deporting Alfredo Garcia has been tangled up in the Supreme Court and in the sort of higher appellate appeals courts, right, in your country. We don't have a separation of powers. The government serves the king deliberately, but Blair sought to introduce a separation of powers using the Americanization of our discourse to make it so that the government only ever does what he wants them to do. Because the judges that are appointed by a quango, which is a quasi-NGO, basically an independent body, an unaccountable body, rather than the Lord Chancellor, the Justice Minister, who is elected. Those judges are appointed by a committee of judges. So it's judges who believe in human rights law that is already written into the law as supreme over Parliament, appointing one another to decide whether or not Parliament can make legislation. And so basically, Tony Blair meant he enshrined his progressive, universalist, liberal politics as the only way of doing politics by taking away accountability from institutions and the law and wresting sovereignty away from Parliament. And the final way he did this in 2010, it was passed by Gordon Brown, his successor, but Gordon Brown was his chancellor for a long time, and Blair had this constitutional architecture in the works when he was in government, passing like a few bills every hour. It was the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act. And what that meant is it put the Civil Service Code into law. And that might not mean a lot to people, but the way that Trump can make, I'm not sure how many thousands of appointments, but there's lots of positions within the Washington bureaucracy and across the country that the president can directly hire and fire. You basically can't do any of that in the UK. Civil servants hire and fire other civil servants, and civil servants can actually replace ministers, but ministers can't replace civil servants. And these people are not elected. So, for example, the cabinet secretary, who runs the business of ministers and the prime minister, is probably the most powerful person in the country. And a great example of how they actually run the country was in the opening of David Goodhart's book, The Road to Somewhere. You would have heard probably this dichotomy between the somewheres and the anywheres, the idea that there's an international liberal business class and their lifestyle means that everything is sort of transitory and that the blank slate makes sense to them, right? They care more about which GDP or tourist destination they can go to than conceiving of a country as a home versus somewheres who are in flyover country or they're in English shires. They're stuck there, and so they have no other country to retreat to when it gets ruined. Anyway.
Yeah, I have a friend who's really into new urbanism, and he talks about this kind of stuff a lot. So it's kind of related to that, like the, yeah.
Oh, it's breaking up a bit.
I just was saying it's kind of related to that. The idea that we've transformed everywhere into nowhere. Like it's all the same because it serves the people who can live anywhere. So they don't have to live in these places that they've made terrible.
Yeah, Christopher Lasch wrote about this in the 90s in the States, where he said that the sort of international professional managerial class have a tourist's relationship with their own country and their capital cities. So this is something that's been observed for quite a long while, both in Britain and America. But he sat down with a guy called Gus O'Donnell, whose initials were shortened to God by the people that worked for him, but obviously because he was all-powerful in the country. And Goodhart explained he was writing a book about this when they were at dinner in Oxford. And he said, when I was working at the Treasury, before I was the cabinet secretary, basically the most powerful civil servant, I used to push for the most open migration policy possible because I thought that my obligation was to global welfare. So these people have a universalist, liberal, telescopically philanthropic ideology that they then feed through every institution, through the law, through the courts that sit above Parliament and mean that they give elected ministers the runaround. And anytime a minister goes, well, there's people in my department that are frustrating my agenda. For example, there's LGBT activist groups that are putting up trans pride flags over government buildings. Or there's an Islamic lobbying network entrenched in the Home Office that prevents us from monitoring Islamic terror, or opens Britain's borders to Islamic countries while denying Christian asylum seekers the right to settle in Britain for a while.
Sorry, what's the Home Office?
The Home Office is basically our State Department or our Department of Homeland Security. Yeah. So when ministers complain about that and they say, look, we had reducing immigration in our manifesto and there's civil servants in the Home Office blocking it, then the minister will be removed for politicizing the civil service, because the civil service has to be non-political according to the code in law. But obviously we know there's no such thing as a non-political civil service, because you wouldn't get involved in politics if you weren't interested in politics.
Okay, it just clicked to me that what you're saying is that it's not just that they believe it, but that you guys have codified into law that the bureaucracy operating the polity has to be unpolitical.
Yes, it's insane. It just means
that's in law. Oh my gosh. Okay. I thought you were just saying that they believed that. And then I just realized you meant that that is like written into the law in the UK. Oh my gosh.
So for example, we've just had this, again, I love when the left goes, look at this thing. Isn't it horrible? And we're like, oh my God, they're correct about this thing. Isn't it great? So we just had a report by an organization called the Runnymede Trust. Runnymede, obviously, where the Magna Carta was first drafted, and it's where the Witan used to be held before the Norman Conquest. They've just taken that name to wear our tradition like a skin suit, because they were the first organization that in 1997, when Tony Blair was elected, introduced the term Islamophobia into Britain. Islamophobia was a term that was cooked up by the Muslim Brotherhood, according to an ex-jihadist who actually testified before Congress, I think in the 2010s, but also a guy called Dr. Giles Kepper. The Muslim Brotherhood cooked it up because they wanted to seek parity for giving cover to their Islamic activism with Jewish activists after the Holocaust and gay rights activists. So they wanted their own term. Anyway, so the Runnymede Trust introduced that term into Britain in 1997. So that's the kind of insidious organization they are. Well, they did a paper the other day saying, isn't it interesting how ever since, I think it was 2002, the Home Office have accrued more powers to actually strip citizenship at the request of the Home Secretary. So there's a series of pieces of legislation that stretch right the way back to 1914 with the Citizenship Act that was passed then, that says that you can basically be denaturalized if your presence in the country isn't conducive to the public good and you're not a natural-born citizen. Now that definition has been tweaked. We got rid of birthright citizenship in 1981, but we still allow people from the Commonwealth, so the ex-imperial territories, to come over and vote in our elections and stand as candidates. So you can be an Indian national and vote for the British Prime Minister without being British national. Fucking insane.
So you don't have to be a citizen, but you have to be a citizen of a former Commonwealth nation.
Yeah.
Okay. That's both worse and better than I thought it was, to be honest.
It's way worse, because then you can just ethnically gerrymander the entire country to hand out citizenship grants. But the Home Secretary now, as of recent legislation passed by the Labour government, basically has the power to unilaterally strip people of citizenship. So we could just denaturalize and deport millions of people. And the Runnymede Trust wrote a paper about this, and they went, oh my God, 3 in 5 non-whites in Britain could be denaturalized tomorrow. That's 13 million people. And that's without the illegals, who we could just deport anyway. So we could solve the population problem overnight by just denaturalizing and deporting not everyone, because we don't need to do that, and that would be unjust, but all the people we don't like. And that's a lot of people. Yeah. So what's interesting is we could do that, but if the civil service laws were not changed, if they weren't fired and rehired, then what you're going to get instead is civil servants strategically not complying with the edicts of the Home Office. And they've done reports time and after time from the last government. I've done a lot of reporting on this, where there are like special interest identity groups in the Home Office that will just not carry out the orders of the Home Secretary or senior civil servants if they don't like them. So they will take bribes to overturn rejected asylum applications from Muslim countries. They will lose paperwork. They will basically just say no and threaten to accuse ministers of politicizing the civil service and report them to the Parliamentary Standards Authority, which yet again is basically like an internal inquisition of ethics codes violations within ministerial departments that civil servants themselves are not subjected to. And as well, one final point before I stop rambling on. I spoke to a former very senior member of British government who tried to change these things and, found themselves on the wrong end of that stick. And they explained that you can't actually dismiss civil servants for non-political reasons because the Treasury will never justify it. So you can't do your own modeling. You can't bring your own outside advice in. Ministers can only act from the briefings that civil servants give to them, because otherwise it's political, right? And you're not taking advice, and you're bringing the impartiality of the civil service into disrepute. So if the Treasury gives you some economic modeling, even if it's shit, you have to abide by it. And so if you say, okay, we've got this deficit here, and the only way we can address the deficit is to cut spending. Fine. What things can you cut spending for? Pensions or welfare? Because those are within the purview of the Chancellor. They're not spending committed into law by things like, the Climate Change Act. Like, we can't cut our climate spending because, yet again, it's dictated by one of these quasi-NGOs that actually run government departments. There's like 444 of them that actually run government departments.
There's over 400?
Yes.
Oh my God.
400. Yeah. So it's worse than you think, man. So if you don't want to cut welfare and you don't want to cut pensions, because obviously that will estrange certain client blocks, do you want to shrink the size of government? Because currently, I think we've got more civil servants per capita than communist China, and government spending is about 45% of every pound spent. So 45p of every pound is spent by the government. So if you want to shrink a government department because it's wasteful, then you go to the Treasury and you say, okay, we'll make these redundancies in this particular quango that's doing some boondoggle that's actually overspending and not delivering. And the Treasury will go, well, okay, but the problem is we've got equalities legislation that means that they can appeal on the grounds that you aren't hitting your statutory duties to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion. And so they can basically appeal using equalities law to stay employed. Or if you win that appeal, we actually have to give them like a year's severance pay. So every single civil servant that gets fired gets a year's pay. And because we do our modeling on a yearly basis, it won't show up. So you can never actually cut the size of a government department because it will never be counted as savings in the modeling that you have to use. Otherwise, you're politicizing the civil service. So the only thing you can ever do is cut pensions, which the government doesn't want to do, or cut welfare, which the government doesn't want to do. So the debt just keeps growing. And so basically, we're going to have an economic collapse.
Wow. Okay. So so it's codified into law that you can't politicize the civil service. That's shocking to me because I mean, like I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that 90% of American politics is intentional politicization of civil service and bureaucracies one way or the other, like on purpose at this point, the AG's office. And yeah, so ostensibly, and you said Schmidt, but I just want to point out to my majority Catholic audience that also Pius XI said this too. In Quadragesimo Anno, he was like extremely clear that there is no such thing as a neutral institution. And he talks about liberalism specifically as power being so real and efficacious that it forms the people at the top form the people at the bottom. And so vice begets vice. And so like, this is not like you don't have to, I try to do this thing where every time I talk about like some political philosopher I show where the principle can be found in the CST, or at least allowed by the CST, specifically so that people will understand that we're not like supplementing Christianity for political ends. So this is in Quadragesimo Anno. So my question, I guess, what is the purpose of the parties then, if they can't politically fight over the things that actually change society, because that's literally illegal? What are the purpose of the party? Like, what are them, that episode of your Sunday show that I was watching that piqued this whole thing in my mind, Oren was pointing out that the interest of the Democrat Party is more power and client people's, client races and client sexuality interest groups, and the purpose of the Republican Party is to just shrink the government so that we have zero power. What are the purposes of your parties then? Like, what's the purpose of the Tories and Labor and the Liberals then?
So a cynic would say that they are just the different marketing arms to different client groups of the same set of policies. And it's because they all, to some extent, barring, I would say maybe 5 MPs total in Parliament that I could name, they all abide by the same narrow confines of the post-war liberal consensus. So we'll get on to how the Conservative Party basically morphed into the self-described heirs to Blair in a moment, because it will prove an instructive example. But the current lay of the political land as it stands is you've got the Labour government, and they came out in the 1920s, and they only became the second major party in the 20th century when, especially in the post-war environment, the post-war government went and tried socialism proper. Like, they established the NHS. They did so, by the way, by selling off parts of the British Empire to the Americans for more Marshall Plan funding. So here's an interesting story that's told by James Barr. The reason that Britain sacrificed the mandate over Palestine to establish the State of Israel was because the American government was basically demanding it as a solution to displaced Jews in the aftermath of the Second World War. And so they said, we'll give you more money and more leniency in post-war financing if you give us a mandate over Palestine. So we gave up the British Empire for the NHS. And we're now basically a socialized healthcare system with a country attached, to the extent to where they're now pushing Canada-style maid-assisted dying policies on our country because we can't afford the pensions and the healthcare for old people. So that was a great win. Anyway, so the Labour Party come out of that tradition, and they've done all sorts of radical things in the 20th century, like abolishing the death penalty and setting up socialized medicine and introducing minimum wages and things like that. And then you get Tony Blair in 1997. But Tony Blair was actually following Margaret Thatcher. And Margaret Thatcher said the greatest part of her legacy was actually Tony Blair. And so, in a weird way, the Labour Party and New Labour under Blair was them fashioning themselves in the image of neoliberal conservatism, because Thatcher slapped, I think it's either Mises or Hayek, a copy of Mises or Hayek on the copy, a copy of it on the table for our ministers, and said, this is what we believe. And he literally has a chapter in that book that says why I'm not a conservative. She said there's no such thing as a society. She set about rapidly privatizing all of Britain's industries, and eventually they got sold off to various foreign governments and foreign companies. So like the Dutch and the Italians and the Germans own our railways, Chinese own large parts of Thames Water and our nuclear infrastructure. It's inexplicable. But basically, there's this, both parties are bought into the post-war consensus with varying degrees of economic protectionism versus neoliberalism. But all of them agree on the blank slate. All of them agree basically on mass migration. All of them agree on Britain being an anti-racist economic zone rather than a home for a particular people. And so the current parties as they exist is, the Labour Party is the party of the system. This is why Keir Starmer gave interviews, I think it was in The Guardian, where he said he doesn't actually dream. He doesn't have a favourite book. He is the civil service in a suit. And that's why he's the least popular prime minister on record since records began, because everyone can see the system isn't working, and all he can do in automaton soulless fashion is defend it. For example, he was hauled up before a select committee the other day, and one of his own MPs asked him if he understands that his new policy of putting inheritance tax on family farms, which means that obviously, because farmers are asset rich and cash poor, they have to sell their farms to presumably Larry Ellison or Bill Gates or whoever else has been visiting number 10 Downing Street recently and wants to buy up the land for server farms or Soylent Green farming. And Keir Starmer responded to the fact that it was raised that farmers are committing suicide to avoid the inheritance tax before it comes into effect. He just said, yeah, ministers have spoken to me about this, but the government has to make sensible reforms. Basically giving the sort of NPC script recital dispassionately without any recognition that people are dying because of his policies. And he could stop it tomorrow. And he's giving the exact same amount, by the way, in subsidies to farmers in Rwanda to grow tea that will be raised from the complete demolition of British farming and policies that are driving farmers to suicide. So he is the party of the system, and he is defending all of the atrocities that the system has made possible. This is why in the aftermath of Southport, when he was being heckled by the parents, a more apt politician like Tony Blair would have pivoted and said, I hear your concerns, I understand your pain, even if he was just gaslighting them. Instead, Starmer convened a press conference twice in a row to call everyone that was concerned about it far-right racists and lost the entire country. So the Labour Party is the party of the system, and it's why, with current polling, they're going to be down to 4 seats at the next election. Bear in mind, they've got like 400 now. So they are the overwhelming one-party state, and they're going to be destroyed.
Oh my gosh. That's crazy.
It would be like the Democrats basically only retaining Ilhan Omar, AOC, Chuck Schumer, and Pelosi after 2024. Like that's the level of electoral wipeout we're about to face. Yeah. So that party has no natural constituency because before they tried to make their constituency this sort of ragtag bunch of the professional managerial class, public sector workers, immigrants, and students. But along came a guy called Zach Polanski, whose real name is not Zach Polanski. He changed it intentionally to be more Jewish, which is crazy.
No, he didn't. He did? That's awesome. They always change it to be less. Guys,
yes.
And he chose Polanski. The one. Yeah. Look, I will not make the Roman Polanski jokes, but that is a terrible decision.
It's basically the reverse of Whoopi Goldberg, because obviously Whoopi Goldberg made her name sound Jewish to get ahead in Hollywood, but obviously she's a black woman and her last name is not actually Goldberg. So he is famous for being a hypnotherapist who claimed he could grow women's breasts through hypnosis. So that's the only thing likable about him. But he has led the Green Party now. No, sadly not. More false promises by socialists, I suppose. And he is modeling himself after Zoran Mandani, and his pitch is basically the Green Party is a coalition of spiteful trans activists, Muslims, and immigrants who just want to take white people's stuff. And he is now, I think, 3rd in the polls. So he has swallowed up Labour's student and immigrant support base. And the reason he's done that is because Labour have basically betrayed those bases because they have come into government, tried to work with the system doesn't work, and so, based on Treasury modelling, the only thing they can do is cut benefits and welfare spending, and so they've done that to stop a debt crisis, but then their natural constituency is welfare dependents, indolent immigrants, public sector workers, and so they're all pissed off and they're leaving the Labour Party. So they're going to the Greens. So the Greens are the party of the camp of the saints. The Labour Party are the party of the system. Nobody likes the system. The Conservative Party are also the party of the system because they caused all the problems that exist now. And the reason the Conservative Party caused those problems is they were the most successful and oldest political party. They're most successful electorally, especially throughout the 20th century. They were in government most of the time. And they're the oldest continuous political party. But as of Tony Blair, the Conservatives had just come out of a long period in government with Thatcher and then John Major. And then the guard changed to Tony Blair, and he basically had the same economic policies as the Conservatives, but underwent that sort of woke, progressive, constitutional vandalism, and he massively increased migration. So under Margaret Thatcher, we had net emigration. It's the one thing she did very well, because she was part of the Monday Club, and even though Enoch Powell was defenestrated for being right too soon about migration, she actually admired Powell. She went to his funeral. So Blair got in, and he expanded the European Union Schengen zone, sort of free movement zone, to encompass Eastern Europe. And they said it's only going to be like 17,000 people. Well, a few 100,000 ended up coming over. So net migration soared from, minus 50,000 to net 100, 200,000. Now, bear in mind, we're a country about the size of New York State.
Yeah. That's, yeah.
Yeah. Well, just
I'll do the math and I'll flash on screen the, I'll do the side-by-side numbers so people can see how crazy that is.
It's going to get crazier. Don't worry. So the Conservatives realized that they weren't winning against Blair because Blair had cool Britannia on his side. The idea that in the 90s, Britain was a cultural exporter with things like the Spice Girls. Going into the 2000s, it was Harry Potter, football and David Beckham, and all the things that you see in the film Love Actually, right? That Hugh Grant's character is based on Tony Blair. So
I didn't know that. That's really funny.
Yeah, so looking back at it in 2003...
He's the least likable one in that film. I know I don't know if I'm supposed to say that or not, but I thought he was the least likable one.
As someone who, before being a married man, had partook in E-Girls, I actually resonate really well with Colin, the character who goes to America. So
Yeah.
there you go. That's I feel represented as a straight white man. Anyway, so Tony Blair, he was so indomitable electorally, despite the mass protests against the Iraq War, despite the discontent with New Labour's immigration policy, that the Conservatives felt the need to turn themselves into the heirs to Blair. That was a phrase that both Michael Gove and David Cameron used. David Cameron, former Prime Minister. Michael Gove, the longest-serving cabinet minister, is now the editor of The Spectator in the UK, and who some people who have followed my channel will know I debated on immigration a couple of months ago, and the head of The Spectator and Unheard, a guy called Freddie Sayers, has hermetically sealed the footage and banned it from coming out because I was quite tough, I suppose. Anyway, so they said they wanted to be heirs to Blair. Michael Gove, when he was running the Department of Education, was handing out copies of Blair's autobiography to civil servants in the department. Blair was, during the Conservative years, swanning about in the Foreign Office, giving unsolicited advice, and that was off the books, but ministers have come out and said it since, so it's not some great revelation or state secret from me. And Theresa May, who was the head of the party at the time, who then was the Home Secretary and obviously the short-lived Prime Minister, she said the Conservatives are perceived as the nasty party. So in order to not be the nasty party, and this is all something that David Cameron has written about in the Times in 2022 in an article titled "We Were All White Men, So I Decided to Do Something About It." David Cameron, not the Labour Party, in the Conservatives, instituted all women and minority shortlists. So diversity quotas, which I'm sure the Republicans, after Winsome Sears and Vivek Ramaswamy and Byron Donalds and on, can see how much of a disaster that might have been. So we got politicians like Kemi Badenoch and Priti Patel and Nuzgani and Caroline Noakes and just complete disaster.
Nuzgani isn't a real name. Please, that's so bad.
She was born in Pakistan, by the way.
Nuzgani, foreigner, yeah.
Yeah. So I think we've got upwards of, I think it's 33 MPs that were born abroad. And of course, that also doesn't count all the other MPs that were born in Britain, but who are not ethnically British. So Vivek is an anchor baby, right? His parents were. Yeah, I do. So is Kemi Badenoch, actually.
Yeah.
So Kemi Badenoch, who currently leads the Conservative Party, was born while her Nigerian parents were visiting the UK, precisely 1 year before Margaret Thatcher repealed birthright citizenship. Yeah. So that's the only reason why she's technically allowed to be an MP, because she was born here and technically has British citizenship. Anyway, so David Cameron instituted those all women and minority shortlists, and they then won the election. And so what you've done then is, rather than recognize that Blair's success was because of his constitutional revolution, his slow motion French revolution that meant that he put the entire British state on rails going in the direction he wanted it to, they thought it was his social progressivism that was the kind of secret sauce. So they actually bought all of the woke bullshit even harder than Labour did. It was the Conservatives who did same-sex marriage. It was the Conservatives who did trans. It was the Conservatives who did all women and minority shortlists. And it was the Conservatives who, under David Cameron, had increased migration to 300,000-400,000. And then under Boris Johnson, people might not know, the infamous Boris wave, increased immigration after Brexit, and Brexit was voted on to take back control. The number one issue that people had for voting Brexit was to reduce migration overall, legal migration, not illegal migration, because it wasn't even an issue at the time. Boris Johnson increased annual migration to over 1 million every year. That is the same amount of legal migration that you guys get for all 50 states.
Yeah.
So we have been just demographically swamped, and they aren't Europeans. So before, those few 100,000, which was, the chief concern was hospital places and jobs and housing. Now, over 80-something% comes from India, Pakistan, Nigeria, the Horn of Africa, the third world. And the only people that actually go back are Chinese students. And they've basically turned all of our universities into a Ponzi scheme where either the sons and daughters of the CCP come over, buy up all the expensive student accommodation. They get graded favorably because the academics are told not to fail them, because otherwise the universities will go bankrupt without the student fees, or they are used as a fast track by Indians and Bengalis to come into the country, who then drop out before the degree is completed to go work for Deliveroo, or they claim asylum. And so we have had something like 4 million immigrants in 4 years. And as well, we have at least 2 million illegal immigrants coming in. So we've had about 200,000 crossing in small boats from France over the English Channel since 2018. And we can't deport any of them because of all the laws that Tony Blair put in place. So this is all the Conservatives' fault. And the Conservatives thought, if you want to understand where they sit in the political lay of the land now, the Conservatives thought, after we received our worst election result in 100 years, led by Rishi Sunak, an Indian man who in 2014 wrote a paper saying Britain should have more Indian immigrants because they vote Conservative. I'm sure there was no ethnic interest there at all. After the Indian Home Secretary, Priti Patel, who introduced the Boris Wave and changed policies despite the advice of the pro-migration Migration Advisory Committee, who said even then, for them, migration would be too much, who described Indian immigrants as living bridges, which is Prime Minister Modi's in India's term for how Indian diasporas can use demographic pressure and translate it into democratic momentum, even after Conservative candidates were signing up to Sikh and Hindu manifestos before the last election. They thought it was a bright idea to then appoint Kemi Badenoch, the leader of their party. So when they, historic levels of migration, thrown out of office because of migration, Reform UK come along from nothing as the anti-immigration party and immediately get 4 million votes and 5 MPs and are now topping the polls with a double-digit lead on every other party. They're at like 28 to 32% given the week. They thought, we will appoint a first-generation Yoruba, because she says, I don't identify as Nigerian or British. I identify as Yoruba, and other Nigerians are my ethnic enemies. Fucking bizarre. Who, personally, when she
made
was...
Ilhan Omar the leader of the GOP is what you're saying. That, yeah. I'm just trying to give it. Yeah, for the Americans, the Conservative Party of the UK made Ilhan Omar the GOP chairwoman.
Yeah, basically. And in 2018, Kemi Badenoch had campaigned for the abolition of caps on student and study visas. So 2 years before the Boris Wave was even a thing, she was demanding it, and she's now in charge. So the Conservatives, as you can imagine, have sunk down to about third or fourth place. So they're going to get decimated. Or they might be they're in fourth place and Labour in fifth place, I think. So Conservative and Labour, the Uniparty, basically the GOP and the Democrats, are not going to exist at the next election as it stands.
So it's going to be Reform, Green, and who else then? Is it?
The Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats are they used to be the none of the above party. They were in the coalition in the 2010s. Their policies were actually co-written by a chap called Paul Marshall, who is a hedge fund investor who apparently, according to reports, started his hedge fund with Soros money. He is the father of Winston Marshall, the podcaster who used to be in Mumford & Sons. He owns ARC, Jordan Peterson's ARC, The Spectator, Unheard. He's about to buy The Telegraph. He owns various think tanks like Policy Exchange. He is one of the main supporters of Kemi Badenoch. He seemed to have been a supporter of Rishi Sunak. And he apparently, according to sources, introduced Zia Yusuf, the former chairman, now seemingly heir apparent of Reform UK, to Nigel Farage. So that network controls absolutely everything. And he was a Liberal Democrat only a few years ago, but he's now the kingpin of conservative right-wing politics. Bizarre. So the Liberal Democrats are basically the party of luxury beliefs. They are an English ethnic party, but they exist in the wealthy, white, homogenous areas where middle-class people have white flighted to, but who, like Piers Morgan, still encourage immigration in the abstract because they like going to curry houses. And so they're very refugees welcome, just not in their back garden. They're very pro-Ukraine, very pro-European Union, they're very pro-trans, because none of this affects them. And they got less votes than Reform at the last election, but because we have a first-past-the-post system, which means whichever party gets the largest share in any given constituency wins the constituency, they have concentrated votes in various constituencies. And so they got something like 3 million votes and 73 MPs. Reform got 4 million votes and 5 MPs. So the Liberal Democrats are probably going to be the opposition.
This is like the first past the post. For me to understand that, this sounds like you're describing gerrymandering, but not geographically. Like you're describing gerrymandering ethnicities and like specific demographics, right? Like, is that what I'm understanding?
Kind of. It is geographic, but it just like the ethnicity and geography kind of map onto one another.
Okay, so it's literally just gerrymandering. All right. Okay.
Basically, yeah. So imagine the same qualification for either a Republican or Democrat to win a given state or county, but applied to the number of parties that would exist in a European political system.
Okay.
So it actually allows splinter parties to have half a chance of getting an MP in Parliament, but it also prevents coalitions, and it makes it much harder for those smaller parties to break through and get an overall majority. But when you do actually break through that electoral ceiling, you can get an overall majority, which is why the Liberal Democrats are probably going to be the opposition party, and they might go into coalition with the Greens just to keep Reform out. But Reform are likely to get an outright majority. And that's because Reform are now occupying the vacant space for an anti-immigration party in Britain. Now, Reform are nowhere near as right-wing as the international press or the domestic parties are making them out to be. Reform is obviously led by Nigel Farage. He was the head of UKIP for a very long time. He was Mr. Brexit. He led the Brexit Party. Then he was the sort of honorary chairman of Reform, and was going to leave to go and work in America, presumably for a job in the Trump administration, until a poll came out that said he would win the seat of Clacton, which was the only seat where a UKIP MP ever was elected, which was Douglas Carswell. He's now living in Mississippi, writing policy, but he was a Conservative MP that defected to UKIP and won his seat. If Farage ran in that seat, the poll said he'd win by a landslide. So he came back and said, I'm going to lead Reform into the next election, become an MP. Because in order to become Prime Minister, you have to already be an MP. So he needed to get elected first to then the next election cycle win as Prime Minister. So he won by a landslide. And there were a bunch of other MPs that also got elected. So the former head of Reform, Richard Tice, got elected. A former Labour councillor who then became a Conservative MP who then defected to Reform after getting kicked out of the Conservative Party for saying Sadiq Khan is an Islamist, because he spent his entire legal career defending, Louis Farrakhan and the living 9/11 hijacker. So he got kicked out for that. And then there were two other candidates that got elected. And the reason I'm telling this story is to illustrate what Reform is as a party. They stand in for a revolt against immigration. And this is the reason why they are basically the party of the dispossessed working class. They kind of code MAGA. But the other candidates that got elected were Rupert Lowe and a guy called James McMurdoch. Now, James McMurdoch, nobody knew who he was. And he wasn't expected to win at all. It's just that Reform was polling really well in Essex, and he sort of squeaked over the line. He's been booted out over some sort of business matter that sort of maliciously was leaked to the press and won't be coming back. But Rupert Lowe is now the most popular politician on social media in Britain. He's just did an interview with Tucker Carlson, which is why people might know him. And he is now an independent MP because he was interviewed by the Daily Mail and spoke rather candidly saying, yeah, Nigel Farage is basically a one-man messiah because he is the most effective campaigner in Britain. But we don't have a shadow cabinet. We don't have any policy. And if an election happens tomorrow, which, an economic crisis could bring that on before 2029, because elections are called at the Labour government's behest. We don't have, like in America, a set election date. We just have, you have to call the election by this time. He said, if we had an election tomorrow, Reform would win an election but wouldn't be able to govern. We would be basically Trump term 1 rather than Trump term 2. And so what he urged is for Farage to cultivate talent, build out a shadow cabinet, make sure he was selecting competent people to be MPs, make sure he knew that when he fired and rehired the civil service by repealing all the legislation I already mentioned, you knew who the appointments need to be. He had all these CVs on file like the Trump administration did.
He wanted Project 2025.
Exactly. And for that, he was kicked out of the party. But the way he was kicked out of the party was malicious. So Zia Yusuf, who is the former chairman of Reform, who left after one of their new MPs suggested that we should ban the burqa. He is a Muslim. So, second most senior figure in the anti-immigration party is a Muslim. Great. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I can see it on your face. Imagine living here. He then came back. I feel
so bad for you, dude. I thought it was bad before. I didn't. It's just like.
Yeah, I know. So
I think if somebody else were describing this, I think the people watching this interview would be like, yeah, you're just making this shit up, dude.
So Zia Yusuf, like George Costanza, quit and then came back the next day with an even more senior role with less accountability. But Zia Yusuf called the police on Rupert Lowe for a conversation that happened 3 months earlier with no witnesses, in which he said Rupert Lowe made threats against his life. And the police raided Rupert Lowe's home. Rupert Lowe, by the way, for anyone who's seen him on Tucker, is a 68-year-old grandfather and a farmer. They raided his house and took all his shotguns, which, of course, Second Amendment advocates would feel pretty sore about. And at the same time, they then launched a misogynistic bullying investigation into Rupert and his staff. Now, what was amazing is that with the help of a few young people that are derided as the very online right, me included, Rupert used social media to just fire off a couple of tweets and refute the allegations. Reform bungled it by releasing the lawyer's report they commissioned before the lawyer had signed off on it. And she ended up siding with Rupert basically and saying, well, hang on a minute, that's not what I said. That's not the conclusions I reached. I was meant to send it for approval beforehand, and you were meant to have right of reply. And so Reform bungled their hatchet job. But now Rupert is without a party. And instead, Rupert's been banned from the party. Ben Habib, who was the former deputy leader, was kicked out of the party because he didn't win his seat. He's now partnered with Tommy Robinson to form a new party called Advance, which is embryonic, but I won't comment on that because they've only just registered. There's nothing there yet. So they've been banned. Tommy Robinson, obviously banned. I have been banned from all of their events, despite speaking at their conference in 2024 and calling for mass deportations, which they've now adopted, but which Farage said one of the reasons he kicked Rupert out was because Rupert was calling mass deportations in March, and he said this is a dark and dangerous use of rhetoric, despite cozying up to the Trump administration, which promised mass deportations, which the administration wasn't very happy about, by the way. I know that for a fact. Anyway, so they're all banned, but this week, or in the last week, we have found who is allowed in Reform. So again, keep in mind that this is the anti-immigration party that's going to win, as current polls project, with a striking landslide. One of the Boris Wave migrants from Bangladesh that Reform has promised to remove indefinite leave to remain from, which means basically if you're here for 5 years, you can stay forever. Crazy policy. They've said they're going to get rid of that. He was here on a student visa. He plans to move to the Middle East to work and return to Bangladesh eventually. They're allowing him to run as a local councillor. He's not a British citizen. He's a Bangladeshi citizen. He announced his candidacy in Bangladeshi, in Bengali, on his Facebook page. And the anti-immigration party is running him as a council candidate. So he's allowed. I'm not. Rupert's not. Ben's not. And The Spectator, again, run by Paul Marshall, overseen by Michael Gove, who banned and deplatformed me, just last week for their Christmas edition, special edition, ran an article by Bonnie Blue. Yes, that Bonnie Blue. Saying,
I did see this. I was hoping we would get to this because I knew about this. Yeah.
She says, I stand with Nigel Farage because of inheritance tax policy. And Danny Kruger, who was a former Conservative MP who has now defected to Reform, who is an evangelical Christian, who heads up Reform's Christian Fellowship, along with Tim Montgomery, a former Conservative advisor, who is a Christian but supports gay marriage. When asked, what do you think about Bonnie Blue's endorsement? He celebrated it. He said, I'm not going to judge. We encourage everyone to vote for us. Well, you don't encourage everyone to vote for you. You cleave off any ally to your right that criticizes Islam or wants mass deportations, but you accept the endorsements of a literal whore and you run a Bangladeshi migrant as a candidate.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I can't say anything. We did that to, what was her name? Amber Rose was we had Amber Rose at the, not speaking at a conservative event, not like writing an article. They gave her a speaking spot at the RNC where they nominated Trump. So that one, he was without saying cast the first stone. Can't from this side of from American perspective, can't say anything about that one because I think we've arguably done the worst version of that. So
I don't know. I think Bonnie Blue beats Amber Rose.
Well, I'm just saying we let her speak at the RNC, dude. Like they nominated Trump at the same event that they were like, let's have this porn star come on and talk.
I wouldn't be shocked if Bonnie Blue is appointed women's minister by 2029.
Oh my gosh. Oh, it's so bad. All right. Wow. Okay. I don't even know what else to. I guess I want to ask. So the thing you were describing about the courts. It sounds like they've just replaced the monarchy with a worse version of the monarchy because traditionally, like if you go back and look at Christendom, like the head of there's a reason it was called court, like you were in the royal court or whatever, because the king was the supreme judge. You can find this in, the example I always give is Saint Louis the IX in France. He would, when he would be called in to judge when a lord and the peasants were having a dispute, right? And he would have to decide whose side was correct or come to make some compromise, and then his rule, whatever he said, went. And it sounds to me like what you're describing with your courts are just like a very much worse version of that without the aristocracy. Is that accurate? Because that's what it sounds to me like.
Yeah, much like in the Bible, when the Israelites were sort of wandering around and bickering and betraying their own principles, and so the legal codes of the likes of Leviticus and Deuteronomy got increasingly complex and had to be presided over by judges, and the nation of Israel only thrived when it had virtuous kings. Is basically that dichotomy of where the system itself pretends that everything can be outsourced to neutral institutions and laws, and that there needs to be no sovereign executive decision maker. The buck stops with nobody. But instead, what actually happens is you have not rule of law, but rule by lawyers who then interpret various bits of non-statutory guidance and apply it to existing law. So a perfect example of this is there is judicial guidance on hate crimes that says that there are transphobic and biphobic hate crimes. That's not in law, but those are the principles of the statutory equality duties that lawyers do have to abide by. And so they have the leniency to ideologically interpret the law and ensure that hate crime charges are brought against people on the grounds that they offend some protected characteristic, which is anyone who isn't a straight white male. So two egregious examples of how that's getting worse. Guidance was quashed earlier in the year that at the 11th hour, it was right before it was brought in, and some people may have been tried under it, but magistrates' courts were going to give more lenient sentences to racial, ethnic, and cultural minorities, religious minorities, LGBTQ plus people, pregnant people, and women, and the disabled. So if you were a straight white man who did the same crime, you would go to prison, whereas other people wouldn't. We've also just had the Labour government let out about 3,000 prisoners early, and they were violent offenders. There have been rapists and people who have committed manslaughter that have been let out deliberately, according to the Justice Minister. What's his name? It slips my mind. But he gave an interview in The Guardian in March, and he said this was explicitly to make room for people making offensive social media posts, like Peter Lynch, who protested peacefully and died in prison after the Southport protest, like Lucy Connolly, like all of those people that the State Department's Human Rights Report earlier this year excoriated the government for throwing in prison. And the other bit of guidance that's coming out soon, and it should be published this week, but it got delayed. It was meant to be published on Monday, but then you had the Bondi Beach attack, is the government's definition of anti-Muslim hatred. It was originally Islamophobia, which was defined in 2019 by an all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims and Hope Not Hate, the communist charity, activist group, as Islamophobia is a kind of racism rooted in racism that targets Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. So it's basically like the what is a woman definition that nobody could provide in Matt Walsh's film. Now it's this really long and bloviating definition you can find on the BBC that it basically says it conflates acts of violence and property damage with unconscious bias, offensive statements on social media, and advocacy for policy that would financially disadvantage Muslims. So basically, if you sit there and say, I don't think we should give money to mosques who are a Christian country, I don't think that foreign nationals should be able to vote in our elections, I think we should denaturalize and deport terrorists, I think that we should talk about the ethnic and religious composition of the Pakistani rape gangs, all of those would be considered Islamophobic. Now, none of that is law. It's guidance, which means that if you have a hate crime charge brought against you or a racially aggravated public order offense brought against you, per the bits of hate speech legislation brought in by Thatcher, Blair, the Conservative government, and now the Labour government, and we arrest 33 people a day at least for that, by the way. If you have a charge brought against you, what informs the law is the unaccountable guidance that was drafted by civil servants and activist NGOs funded by the government. And so if you have a hate crime charge brought against you, for example, for offending Muslims, and your activity, which can be purely speech, fits that definition, that broad definition of anti-Muslim hatred, then you can be tried with a hate crime and imprisoned for, what was the maximum penalty? It's like 2 and a bit years. And so you've now got the situation where mothers like Lucy Connolly with no prior convictions are imprisoned for 34 months for an imprudent tweet that she deleted, whereas an Ethiopian sex offender gets 14 months for attacking a 19-year-old girl with learning disabilities, but he serves no time in prison because his time spent on remand is counted as his prison sentence. So we basically do have that the judicial activists, who are all part of socialist lawyers guilds as well, who fully buy into DEI and woke and blank slate liberalism when it suits, they run the country versus the monarchy. And the problem we have actually is that the monarch is actually okay with this. King Charles, if you would have seen videos of him, keeps hosting Jewish and Muslim events on royal property, including with members of Hope Not Hate.
Yeah, I've seen Father Robinson theorize that the good king is not Christian. So I don't know. I don't want to ask you about that because that seems like a dangerous thing to talk about.
Well, it's not dangerous.
No,
I don't think it's dangerous. I mean, if I had any self-regard, I wouldn't be challenging all this stuff, right? If they come for me, they come for me. I've got Solzhenitsyn books on my shelf for a reason, you know. But I would say he's at least an Arabist, and this is a very strong strain of thought.
Yeah.
Among men of that generation. Like, it's very strong in the Conservative Party under David Cameron. David Cameron was encouraging Muslims to take expedited routes to the top of businesses and seniority in the Conservative Party. He appointed Saeeda Vorsi, the head of the Conservative Party, and she seems to only care about Muslim sectarian issues. She literally wrote a book last year saying why Muslims don't matter, accusing the entire country of hating Muslims. And Charles seems focused on fostering interfaith dialogue, but that only means turning the Church of England and the monarchy into another vessel for blank slate liberal platitudes and containing Islam and Judaism and every faith in the parameters of value neutral liberalism. So basically, he's like he's basically the woke Leviathan. He is the guy on the front cover of Hobbes's Leviathan, the Penguin Classics edition, except, you know, waving the pride flag with a prayer mat under his arm. It's the incoherence doesn't matter. It's just that everything fits within the parameters of liberalism because fundamentally, deep down, they think everyone's a blank slate. And that strain of Arabism was very popular in Oxford and the like in the 70s. Alfred Guillaume has a book on this where he describes Islam in very frank terms, and it's very revealing, but he thinks that Islamic civilization amounts to Saudi architecture and calligraphy rather than, you know, cousin marriage and suicide bombing. And that's the delusion that a lot of our politicians have operated under. And that's why they've imported so many Muslims. They've given Muslims positions of authority in the Home Office, in the security services, via DEI. And that's why actually the Americans and other countries have decided to stop sharing intelligence with us, either selectively or outright, because anytime they pick up the phone, there's a Muslim on the other end of it. So why are they going to try and prevent Islamic terror when they're just feeding it into a Muslim activist network that now controls the highest offices of state? And the king has sat idly by and either encouraged it as part of the World Economic Forum, as part of his climate initiatives, as part of the Prince's Trust charity that was involved in paying influencers and YouTubers like, who's the trans one? Not ContraPoints, the other one, the English one. There was the allegation that the Prince's Trust paid them to promote the vaccine during COVID. And he's also been much the same with things like Islam and Judaism while being very quietist about the Church of England, which itself is probably just going to collapse. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I was trying to look up who that YouTuber was. I couldn't find him. Okay. And what is the, so I guess this will be the last question because this will kind of get us to a little bit on every aspect of British politics. As far as I know, I'm probably wrong, but as far as I know, this will be a good. So what changed? When did it seems like if you read, was it the late Queen Elizabeth that started this with the monarchy just kind of helping all of the progressive causes, or was it like, did she change over time? Why is that situation the way it is now? Because it doesn't seem like it was, if I read, you read the World War I and II histories, and it just doesn't seem like this. I just can't figure out how you got from there to here, like as far as the monarchy's, as a office approval of all this.
I think it's convention.
Okay.
The idea that it's inappropriate for the monarchy to intervene politically, because Queen Elizabeth II very rarely did. This is why every prime minister that met with her has a very positive opinion of her, even if they disagreed substantively. It's because she was just interpersonally nice to them. That's why she and Donald Trump got along very well, for example. We don't really know the Queen's personal opinions on anything. And so I think history will actually revise Queen Elizabeth II's reign as one of stewardship over a preventable period of catastrophic decline. And I am a monarchist, but I'm not a royalist. And the distinction means I don't have much respect for the reigning House of Windsor. And I think they've brought the monarchy into disrepute, perhaps irreparably so, because the level of Republican sentiment, Republican, not party, obviously, but form of government, has swelled to historic highs in Britain now, either through apathy or liberal ideology that believes in the leveling of all hierarchies. And I don't see how the Windsors rescue themselves, and unless they allow whatever government needs to come in and rip out all that constitutional architecture and deport the people that don't belong here and basically do a sort of Bukele-style campaign in Britain, unless they sign off on all that, unless they give royal assent to it, unless they expedite the process, I don't see how the reputation of the institution survives the disrepute that the Windsors have brought to it. I think it would only take basically either, King William becoming base, and there's no signs that he will be, or the abdication of the House of Windsor and someone else brought in, but I don't know who the next successor would be. I think it would take that to save the monarchy at this point. And the thing is, you need the monarchy, not just because, back to the Bible, it's the way that human beings are best governed, but because in order to regain that constitutional architecture that makes Parliament sovereign, you have to mean that the government serves His Majesty and that Parliament has sovereignty over everything else, rather than the government being a subsidiary, the marketing arm of quangos and lawyers and NGOs and the various beams in the cathedral.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's a fair.
I've depressed you. I've thoroughly depressed you.
Yeah, that's just said. It's not the. I mean, it's depressing. Yeah, it's sad. I would say, first of all, everybody should pray for the British. Pray for our. I was gonna make a. Oh, I couldn't find it. Dang, that's so. I had the punch. I couldn't find the punchline. It was, the Vatican calls the Jews the old elder brothers in the faith. I was trying to find elder brothers in law or something. I don't know. Totally missed the punchline there.
Can I say one quick thing though that might sound insane? I'm actually more bullish for us than I am for you guys.
Oh, I actually am. Yeah, no, I think. No, we can talk about this if you want. I'll be happy to talk about this, but yeah, no, I think we're more screwed than you guys are, because you guys have. I think you can actually find this in like Aquinas's philosophy on law and on kingship, where he's very, very clear that Thomas says, like, ideally a king shouldn't rule over more than he can see from his castle, I think is the line, which is clearly like a rhetorical point, but he's basically meaning like whatever is outside of your human capacity to control and interact with, like you would not be a fit ruler for it. And America, not only the contiguous, the lower 48 or all 50, adding Hawaii and Alaska, but like not only is that too big, which it is, to be adequately ruled in a way which is in line with subsidiarity and Christian principles, but we've expanded it beyond that to the globalist American empire, to where we now rule basically the entire globe in some way or another, meaning that any solution to it, like there are peaceful solutions to what's happening in the UK. There are ways that it can be done with, I guess not peaceful. The solution to what's happening in the UK would require orders of magnitude less bloodshed than fixing the problems in the United States, or what is likely to happen if the problems in the United States are fixed, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yes, and also we can liquidate our bureaucracy with a day one repeal of all the laws that keep it there. Liquidate by hire and fire, not so bloodshed, because nobody wants that. And also, even though our likelihood of ethnic conflict is more likely than America, you're already in a hot political civil war. It's just that your elites haven't picked factions yet, or at least haven't. I mean, they're already telling members of the military to disobey orders and basically act in position against Hegseth. So they kind of have. But also, just your constitutional architecture and your separation of powers means the executive has a harder time just getting things done. But if we just restored sovereignty to Parliament and had a compliant or supportive monarch, we could do remigration within a year. We could. We've still got loads of problems. This is appalling that most people don't know. 1 in 3 pregnancies in Britain ends in abortion. That's.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, most people don't know that. The marriage rate's far worse than the US. There's an encouraging sign of Christian revival, especially Catholicism, because among under 30s, Catholics outnumber Anglicans 2-1, and that's mainly conversions of young white men. It's not to do with immigration. So there is but we are much more deracinated than America. America still has no politician talks about God really in our politics, and when they do, they talk about it for 10 seconds and then endorse Bonnie Blue. So we've got much deeper cultural and spiritual problems, but in terms of legislation, we can turn the ship of state around a lot easier. It just requires courage and know-how. The problem we have is actually the leadership vacuum. Other than Rupert Lowe and 3 or 4 conservative politicians who are nowhere near power and are in a dead vessel of a party, we have nobody who understands what time it is, nor the stomach to do what needs to be done.
Yeah.
So
what I meant is the plausible solutions to Americans' problems, I think, have a upwards of 75% chance in resulting in millions of bodies in some type of hot civil war. And I don't see that in the most likely solutions to your problems like you're describing. So that's kind of why I think our solving America's problems are harder and more dangerous, just because it does have something to do with the geography of it. This is a really long discussion, but just because you have so much geography and you have so much, you have California and you have New York and you have the New England area, you have these geographic and the West Coast with Washington and Oregon, you have these actual places with geographically natural borders that will not comply with fixing the problems, which just to me seems like a recipe for the absolute worst thing possible to happen. So anyway, thank you so much for doing this, Connor. I would love to talk with you about gardening and comic books sometime.
When we win.
When we win, we'll talk about gardening and comic books. What's your favorite? Real quick though, let's wrap on this. Wrap on a high note. Hello. Oh, there we go. Wrap on a high note. What's your favorite comic book? What's your favorite comic book adaptation? And what kind of thing do you garden?
Oh, okay. Garden. Right before the cold snap that just came and taken all the leaves off my trees and plants. I had a fantastic grapevine growing up around an old wall that I demolished the other half of and just sort of left the rest in a little alcove at the bottom of my garden. A nice willow tree. I've got loads of hot lips plants and giant lilies, and so hopefully they'll spring up in the summer because that's my one little corner of joy. Yeah, love listening to audiobooks, running the lawnmower around. You know, it's the only thing that a man has to himself. As far as comic books go, I mean, the library behind me should give it away.
You're a DC guy, I can tell.
Yeah. I've got a whole other one literally like that's just all omnibuses. Favorite ones, I would say, Alan Moore Swamp Thing's excellent. Superboy Boy of Steel, the miniseries with Francis Manapul and Jeff Johns. Batman Hush, which was my first and only love. And Long Halloween, Dark Victory are fantastic as well. So all recommended. Favorite comic book adaptation? I mean, this. I mean, it could be
a video game or a movie or a TV show or anything, really.
Yeah, so this is going to be contentious. Snyder's 4 DC films are fantastic, and I
actually agree with you on this. Yeah, I think they're.
Yeah, well, I think that they accidentally tap into. Obviously, C.S. Lewis described the kind of undercurrents of reality as the Tao, and sometimes you chip away at the rock and you find the ore vein of deep, objective moral truths. And there's just something about Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, how he augmented Watchmen away from what communist Hagrid had originally intended. And then, despite casting choices, the climax in Justice League that taps at things like existentialism and heroism and Christianity and the repudiation of nihilism and subjectivism. Like, all of these things are really strong themes in there. And so it's just a massive shame that as soon as he wrapped Justice League, obviously, you know, it took like 4 years for the actual version to come out rather than Joss Whedon's total abortion. But after that, he's just like crashed out hard. Like, politically. He's like doing some like lesbian action film now. It's just, oh man, I wish he would have retired and went out on a high.
Yeah. I did love Watchmen. I don't think Watchmen is as bad as everybody says it is. I do wish he had kept some of the color palette from the comic book, because my one favorite, the one thing I like the most about the graphic novel is that it's like the story is really depressing, but the way it looks is like if you just showed it to somebody who couldn't read or like comprehend what was on the page, just the color palette itself is actually kind of upbeat and bright, and that contributes well to the We'll cut it there. I was just saying that I think it contributes well to the discomfort you feel when you read it. So thanks again, Connor. I really appreciate this. Everybody should, if you're not following Connor, if you're watching this, you're not following Connor somehow, look up Connor Tomlinson on YouTube. What's your at on X?
It's at Con_Tomlinson. I'll shoot you something over to put in the description. I'm sure we can do the YouTube collab settings, so people should be able to click.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, we'll do the collab settings. Yeah, it'll be there on Connor's channel, and then and I'll just link in the description your X and any other socials you send me. So, all right, thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it.